Between the time when the oceans drank Atlantis and the rise of the sons of Arius, there was an age undreamed of. And unto this, Conan, destined to bear the jeweled crown of Aquilonia upon a troubled brow. It is I, his chronicler, who alone can tell thee of his saga. Let me tell you of the days of high adventure.
Welcome, dear listener, to another episode of Conan Chronicles. My name's Dan, the usual host of this show, and today we're going to be doing a review and retrospective on the 9th story in Conan's publication history, Iron Shadows in the Moon, or, as it's called in some publications, Shadows in the Moonlight. As has been the case, usually, our scribe is Mr. Robert E. Howard, and he had this story published for the first time in the April 1934 issue of Weird Tales magazine. Right away, the story begins in a moment of peril for Conan's love interest in the story, the former princess known as Olivia. Olivia is a woman of incredible beauty and the daughter of the king of Ophir. When the beautiful princess had come of age, her father, the king, sought to arrange a marriage for his daughter to a Cothian prince as an instrument in his political ambitions. Olivia, being a woman who sought to forge her own destiny, refused her father's wishes. Enraged by Olivia's attempt to avoid her traditional duties as a noblewoman, her father suddenly found no further use for his daughter. He decides immediately to sell her into brutal slavery and prostitution. When we first meet the young noblewoman turned slave, she's desperately fleeing from her latest master, a cruel man named Shah Amurath. Amurath is the ruler of a grand city called Akif, and when we meet him, he's swiftly in pursuit of Olivia on horseback, his escaped favorite plaything. Amurath eventually catches up with the terrified Olivia before some beastly creature emerges from the nearby swamp.
"Let me go!" begged the girl, tears of despair staining her face. "Have I not suffered enough? Is there any humiliation, pain, or degradation you have not heaped on me? How long must my torment last?" "As long as I find pleasure in your whimperings, your pleas, tears, and writhings," he answered with a smile that would have seemed gentle to a stranger. With a quickness her tender limbs could not approximate, he caught her wrist, twisting it in pure, wanton cruelty, until she screamed and sank to her knees. "Slut! I should drag you back to Akif at my horse's tail, but I will be merciful and carry you on my saddle bow, for which favor you shall humbly thank me, while—" He released her with a startled oath and sprang back, his saber flashing out, as a terrible apparition burst from the reedy jungle, sounding an inarticulate cry of hate. Olivia, staring up from the ground, saw what she took to be either a savage or a madman advancing on Shah Amurath in an attitude of deadly menace. He was powerfully built, naked but for a girdled loincloth, which was stained with blood and crusted with dried mire. From under the tangle of his locks, bloodshot eyes glared like coals of blue fire. The stranger's bloodthirsty joy was terrible to behold. His jaws champed spasmodically, froth appeared on his blackened lips. "Keep back," ordered Shah Amurath, watching him narrowly. Ha! It was like the bark of a timber wolf. Shah Amurath, the great lord of Akif. Oh, damn you! How I love the sight of you, you who fed my comrades to the vultures, who tore them between wild horses, blinded and maimed and mutilated them. Ah, you dog! You filthy dog! His voice rose to a maddened scream, and he charged.
Angered by Amurath's command to slaughter Conan's Kozaki brothers-in-arms prior to the events of the story, the barbarian unleashes all of his hate and anger on the man, tearing him with his blade into a pile of gory ribbons. With his monstrous lust for vengeance satiated, Conan turns to jump into a nearby boat and flee, before Olivia pleads for Conan to take her with him. She admits to herself that she is afraid of this monstrous man from the swamps, but believes she has a better chance at surviving if she sails with him than remaining there, close by to the ruler of Akif's mangled corpse. Conan allows her to travel with him, and the two set out onto the open sea. Olivia drifts off to sleep as the Cimmerian rows all night toward one of the islands that dot the inland sea. Olivia awakens the next morning as they are approaching this island, and the two eventually disembark. As soon as they land on this mysterious island, a frightening omen of what lurks there flutters through the trees toward them. What appears to be a giant and ancient parrot approaches and screeches in some unrecognizable human tongue. It says, "Yok Tha Zuthala." The parrot flies away, laughing sinisterly in the voice of a human as he goes. Warily, the pair continue to explore the island, and eventually stumble upon yet another eerie sight.
And in the midst of that plateau rose a long, broad structure of crumbling greenish stone. They gazed in wonder. No legends named such a building on any island of Vilayet. They approached it warily, seeing that moss and lichen crawled over the stones, and the broken roof gaped to the sky. But now only the long, hall-like structure rose against the sky, and its walls leaned drunkenly among the crawling vines. Grasping his sword firmly, Conan entered with the slouching gait of a hunting panther, sunken head and noiseless feet. Olivia tiptoed after him. Once within, Conan grunted in surprise, and Olivia stifled a scream. "Look! Oh, look!" "I see," he answered. "Nothing to fear. They are statues." "But how lifelike and how evil!" she whispered, drawing close to him. They were statues, apparently of iron, black and shining as if constantly polished. They were life-sized, depicting tall, lithely powerful men with cruel hawk-like faces. They were naked, and every swell, depression, and contour of joint and sinew was represented with incredible realism. But the most lifelike feature was their proud, intolerant faces. These features were not cast in the same mold. Each face possessed its own individual characteristics, though there was a tribal likeness between them all. There was none of the monotonous uniformity of decorative art, in the faces at least. "They seem to be listening and waiting," whispered the girl uneasily.
These strange ruins and their men of iron make Olivia so uneasy that she asks Conan to leave the island. He agrees and begins their journey towards the boat, before he spies the sail of a pirate vessel on the horizon, sailing towards them. Despite Olivia's initial fears, Conan tells her it's probably safest to wait for this ship to pass the island overnight. That way their boat won't be spotted by the pirates if they pass them. He leads the princess back to the crumbling green ruins and their iron residence to sleep, as it's the only form of shelter they had yet discovered on this strange island. After a while, Olivia manages to calm her fears and falls into a weary slumber. Soon, the princess begins to conjure images of pure horror in her dreams.
Olivia dreamed, and through her dreams crawled a suggestion of lurking evil, like a black serpent writhing through flower gardens. Her dreams were fragmentary and colorful, exotic shards of a broken, unknown pattern, until they crystallized into a scene of horror and madness, etched against a background of cyclopean stones and pillars. She saw a great hall whose lofty ceiling was upheld by stone columns marching in even rows along the massive walls. Among these pillars fluttered great green and scarlet parrots, and the hall was thronged with black-skinned, hawk-faced warriors. Neither they, nor their garments, nor weapons resembled anything of the world the dreamer knew. They were pressing about one bound to a pillar, a slender, white-skinned youth with a cluster of golden curls about his alabaster brow. His beauty was not altogether human, like the dream of a god chiseled out of living marble. The black warriors laughed at him, jeered and taunted in a strange tongue. The lithe, naked form writhed beneath their cruel hands. Blood trickled down the ivory thighs to splatter on the polished floor. The screams of the victims echoed through the hall, then lifting his head toward the ceiling and the skies beyond, he cried out a name in an awful voice. A dagger in an ebon hand cut short his cry, and the golden head rolled on the ivory breast. As if in answer to that desperate cry, there was a rolling thunder as of celestial chariot wheels, and a figure stood before the slayers, as if materialized out of empty air. The form was of a man, but no mortal man ever wore such an aspect of inhuman beauty. There was an unmistakable resemblance between him and the youth who dropped lifeless in his chains, but the alloy of humanity that softened the godliness of the youth was lacking in the features of the stranger, awful and immobile in their beauty. The blacks shrank back before him, their eyes slits of fire. Lifting a hand, he spoke, and his tones echoed through the silent halls in deep, rich waves of sound. Like men in a trance, the black warriors fell back until they were ranged along the walls in regular lines. Then from the stranger's chiseled lips rang a terrible invocation and command. Yag kulan yak tha, suthala. At the blast of that awful cry, the black figures stiffened and froze. Over their limbs crept a curious rigidity, an unnatural petrification. The stranger touched the limp body of the youth, and the chains fell away from it. He lifted the corpse in his arms. Then, ere he turned away, his tranquil gaze swept again over the silent rows of ebon figures, and he pointed to the moon, which gleamed on through the casements. And they understood those tense waiting statues that had been men.
Olivia awakens in a cold sweat and quickly returns her frantic gaze to the moonlight, slowly creeping through the wrecked roof of the ruins toward the iron statues on the floor. She watches as the figures begin to slowly twitch and flex their muscles, as if the hawk-faced figures were beginning to emerge from a prolonged state of paralysis. Olivia panics. She spastically tells Conan of her horrific dream and flees the ruins, running out into the night. The girl manages to convince Conan that it wouldn't be wise to go back into those ruins, despite the fact that they were not pursued by anyone, and the barbarian himself, who had been sitting guard, saw nothing. He tells her that they should head to the nearby plateau, so that he can make a raft the morning they reach the coast, and leave this insane island behind. For a long time they walk, before being forced to stop directly in their tracks.
Just before dawn, I heard the creak of timbers and the rasp and clack of cordage and oars. A ship has put in and anchored at the beach not far away. Probably the ship whose sail we saw yesterday. An Hyrcanian craft from the cut of her rigging, muttered Conan. I wonder if the crew... A distant medley of voices reached their ears, and creeping to the southern edge of the cliffs, they saw a motley horde emerge from the fringe of trees along the western rim of the plateau, and stand there a space in debate. Pirates, whispered Conan, a grim smile on his thin lips. I'm going to meet these dogs. If I succeed in my plan, all will be well, and we'll sail away with them. There were some 70 of them, a wild horde made up of men from many nations. Kothians, Zamorians, Byruthenians, Corinthians, Shemites. Their features reflected the wildness of their natures. Many bore the scars of the lash or the branding iron. There were cropped ears, slit noses, gaping eye sockets, stumps of wrists, marks of the hangman as well as scars of battle. Most of them were half naked, but the garments they wore were fine. Gold-braided jackets, satin girdles, silken breeches, tattered, stained with tar and blood, vied with pieces of silver-chased armor. Jewels glittered in nose rings and earrings, and in the hilts of their daggers. Over against this bizarre mob stood the tall Cimmerian, in strong contrast, with his hard bronzed limbs and clean-cut, vital features. "Who are you?" they roared. "Conan the Cimmerian." His voice was like the deep challenge of a lion. "Who's your chief?" "I, by Eastar," bellowed a bull-like voice, as a huge figure swaggered forward. A giant, naked to the waist, where his capacious belly was girdled by a wide sash that upheld voluminous silken pantaloons. His head was shaven except for a scalp lock. His mustaches drooped over a rat-trap mouth. Green Shemitish slippers with upturned toes were on his feet, a long straight sword in his hand. Conan stared and glared. "Sergius of Carustra, by Crom." "Aye, by Eastar," boomed the giant, his small black eyes glittering with hate. "Do you think I had forgot? Ha! Sergius never forgets an enemy." "Aye, send your dogs at me, big belly," sneered Conan with bitter scorn. "You were always a coward, you Gothic cur."
Conan provokes the pirate chieftain into a duel, which Conan wins and declares himself the crew's new chief. However, one of the pirates quickly slings a stone at the barbarian's skull, knocking him to the ground unconscious in a pool of blood. Olivia watches on with astonishment. She had come to fancy this barbarian after spending time with him. Her initial fear of this wild man had faded. He had proved to be a loyal protector throughout their journey on the island.
Her overwrought brain was almost ready to collapse. Left alone and unprotected, she realized how much the protection of the Cimmerian had meant to her. There intruded, vaguely, a wonderment at the mad pranks of fate that could make the daughter of a king the companion of a red-handed barbarian. With it came a revulsion toward her own kind. Her father and Shah Amurath, they were civilized men, and from them she had had only suffering. She had never encountered any civilized man who treated her with kindness unless there was an ulterior motive behind his actions. Conan had shielded her, protected her, and, so far, demanded nothing in return. Laying her head in her rounded arms, she wept, until distant shouts of ribald revelry roused her to her own danger.
The pirates bind the barbarian's unconscious body and carry him toward the ruins, where they too hoped to find shelter for the night. Olivia follows stealthily behind them and witnesses the pirates make camp in the ruins, where whatever devils haunted her dreams lie, waiting for prey in their iron casts. Olivia waits until nightfall, after the pirates are long asleep, and nervously approaches the ruins, hoping that the moonlight had not yet awakened the iron statues within. She sneaks into the camp and frees Conan. The barbarian grasps the woman in his arms and sprints out of the camp as fast as he can. The pair makes it a good distance from the ruins before they encounter yet another bizarre horror.
Out of the shadows of the cliffs moved a monstrous, shambling bulk, an anthropomorphic horror, a grotesque travesty of creation. In general outline, it was not unlike a man, but its face, limned in the bright moonlight, was bestial, with close-set ears, flaring nostrils, and a great flabby-lipped mouth, in which gleamed white tusk-like fangs. It was covered with shaggy, grayish hair, shot with silver which shone in the moonlight, and its great misshapen paws hung nearly to the earth. Its bulk was tremendous. As it stood on its short, bowed legs, its bullet head rose above that of the man who faced it. The sweep of the hairy breast and giant shoulders was breathtaking. The huge arms were like knotted trees. This was less a struggle between man and beast than a conflict between two creatures of the wild, equally merciless and ferocious. With a flash of white tusks, the monster charged.
The beast almost snaps Conan's neck before he's able to ferociously stab the giant ape creature in its groin and belly. The ape suffers in silence, attempting to dispose of the barbarian and showing absolutely no pain. Eventually, however, the creature falls, and Conan staggers over its massive corpse. He tells Olivia that he suspects the creature is a gray man-ape, a monstrous species that usually dwells in the hills that border the eastern shore of the sea. Suddenly, shrieks of agony coming from the ruins pierce the night, and the pair wheels towards them. They run for their lives toward the abandoned pirate ship docked at the edge of the shore, and Conan hoists them both aboard. Conan and Olivia are about to leave, when the remaining crew members that had not been slaughtered by the iron giants in the moonlit ruins approach through the woods. Conan asks the pirates to surrender themselves to him as their new captain or die. The half-dead pirates desperately agree, and the crew sails towards some distant king named Yildiz's kingdom. Olivia asks Conan if she can come with him as his pirate queen. The barbarian happily agrees, and the lovers set sail Towards war and plunder, the barbarian plans to rip from a king's grasp. In Finn J.D. John's complete Weird Tales Conan omnibus, he says that Iron Shadows in the Moon was the first of these middle period of Conan stories that Howard wrote. The story was written nearly a year before it was eventually published in any issue of Weird Tales. I've talked about this, quote, middle period of Conan stories before in prior videos, but to summarize, for people that didn't see those, this middle period is described by many Howard fans of being lesser in quality when compared to some of the stories written before and after. This period is also characterized by Howard's adherence to a variety of genre tropes that he put in these stories so that Weird Tales editorial was sure to purchase the stories and publish them. Howard threw these tropes into his stories because Weird Tales editorial believed that things like ancient ruins, supernatural threats, shapely damsels in distress, and an ending where Conan looks forward to open seas and easy plunder would be to the liking of their readership. At the time, Howard was also living through the Great Depression, so he and probably everybody else needed money desperately just to get by. I wouldn't say that Iron Shadows in the Moon is the worst Conan story I've read. I think that my least favorite of these so far is still The Pool of the Black One. However, I do have to say this story definitely ranks, I would say, second to the bottom in my ranking of Howard's Conan stories, just above that story. I do like it more than The Pool of the Black One almost exclusively because of Olivia and the themes that Howard plays with related to what it meant to be a woman during such brutal times as the age Conan and Olivia lived in. In any case, Iron Shadows in the Moon, as a whole, anyway, reads like a hodgepodge of ideas that Howard had for Conan stories, all thrown into a blender without the page count to really flesh any of them out. It also doesn't help that many of the elements that Howard threw into the blender for this story are also the ones he uses in other, often better stories, in my opinion, that he wrote later. Allow me to demonstrate. In The Pool of the Black One, Conan and a crew of pirates drop anchor on a mysterious, uncharted island. After doing some exploration, Conan finds a shining city comprised almost entirely out of some emerald material. Conan then discovers that a species of demonic giants with ebony skin lives in the city, and witnesses them sacrifice a young member of Conan's pirate crew into their mysterious ritual pool. The young man magically emerges as a miniature stone statue afterwards, and Conan eventually defeats the giants. In Iron Shadows in the Moon, Conan and Olivia row to a mysterious island and discover some ancient emerald ruins where gigantic ebony-skinned giants are frozen in place as iron statues. During Olivia's dream, she witnesses a ritual that created these giant and monstrous creatures. She sees a young god decapitated in a ritual sacrifice, which results in the creation of these iron statues, after what appears to be the god's father appears and curses them. In The Pool of the Black One, Conan stumbles upon a group of pirates, challenges the crew's captain for control of his band, and eventually wins the position by the end of the story, after he kills the captain. In Iron Shadows in the Moon, Conan and Olivia stumble upon a group of pirates. Conan challenges the crew's captain to a duel, and kills him. By the end of the story, Conan is their pirate captain. In The Pool of the Black One, Conan ends the story with a beautiful woman who wishes to be his pirate queen on his arm, laughing about the open seas and easy plunder on the horizon for him and his crew. In Iron Shadows in the Moon, Conan ends the story with Olivia on his arm, a beautiful woman who wishes to be his pirate queen, laughing about the open seas and easy plunder on the horizon for him and his crew. In The Pool of the Black One, an ex-noblewoman turned sex slave is Conan's love interest. In Iron Shadows in the Moon, Olivia is a former princess, aka a noblewoman, who was sold into sex slavery by her father. In Rogues in the House, Conan fights a colossal ape that Howard describes as a confrontation between two wild beasts. Conan stabs the ape monster. It takes much more punishment than any human could, but at the end of the story, it falls and Conan wins the fight. In Iron Shadows in the Moon, Conan fights this gray ape man, a colossal ape creature, that takes many more stab wounds than any human could withstand before falling. During the fight, Howard describes the confrontation between Conan and this gray ape man as a confrontation between two wild beasts. In The Frost Giant's Daughter, the daughter of a god is being pursued by a possessed Conan. Conan had been worked into a lusty, angry fervor by the goddess, so that his heart could be ripped out in a ritual sacrifice to her father. Conan almost rapes the Frost Giantess before she calls into the heavens for her father to save her. Her father, Ymir, an old god and king of the Frost Giants, intervenes to save her from Conan. In Iron Shadows in the Moon, a young god of some sort is about to be ritually sacrificed by the Black Giants before he calls into the heavens for his father to save him. The young god is decapitated as a part of the ritual just before his elder god father arrives. In his rage, he casts a spell on the Black Warriors so that they will spend the rest of their days as iron statues, only awakening at night. In The Slithering Shadow, Conan and his love interest, Natala, stumble upon the ruins of a nearly dead civilization called Zuthal. The remaining citizens spend their days in a mystically created dream world and do little but revel in their own evil and hedonism. This is all while an evil god stalks the halls of the city, feeding on those who remain. In Iron Shadows in the Moon, we see Conan and Olivia discover a dead civilization, where a vengeful god has cursed its remaining citizens to live as iron statues, only active once the moonlight shines upon them. Olivia also witnesses the curse being placed on these demonic giants by this father god, and hears him yell Zuthala as a part of his incantation via vivid, supernatural dream visions. The list goes on, but I think you get the point. Knowing that this story was written before Rogues in the House and The Pool of the Black One, for example, makes me think that these are ideas Howard liked initially. He threw them all into one story, but then later fleshed them out a bit more in separate stories. You know, like one has an ape man as the villain, one is a pirate adventure featuring these demonic black giants as the villains, etc. The Pool of the Black One is definitely the lesser of these two stories, I would say, because it's also light on details regarding these demonic black giants, but that story at least feels somewhat more focused than Iron Shadows in the Moon. One of the few things that's set up at the beginning of the story that's paid off is Howard gives an explanation for a rock that is mysteriously hurled at Conan and Olivia shortly after they arrive on the island. After Conan kills the ape man, he says to Olivia it's his prediction that the ape man was the one that had thrown that rock at them. Most of the interesting and eerie elements of the story just appear with little to no elaboration. Like I've said, some of the images in the story are really cool and interesting, but I was honestly unimpressed that we didn't get much else than that. I would say, though, the thing I found interesting about this story, other than the as per usual great characterization of Conan that Howard brings to the table with these stories, was the theme that Howard plays with about womanhood during this Hyborian age. Throughout the story, we see Olivia haggard and traumatized by the circumstances of her life before she met Conan. She was born into a noble family where her role in society was already chosen for her. From the day she was born, her father likely planned to use his daughter as a mere pawn in a Machiavellian scheme to further his own power and influence. The choices that Olivia was presented with from a very early stage in her life were either acquiescence to her father's machinations and be the dutiful daughter and wife she's expected to be, or be cast out of her family. And being cast out of her family meant, of course, losing all the wealth and privilege that came with the circumstances of her birth. In the story, Olivia doesn't allow her father to choose who her husband will be for her. She seeks to forge her own destiny. Her father, in a stroke of evil genius, robs Olivia not just of her wealth, status, and privilege of her nobility, but also her ability to make her own decisions about how she will live her life regardless. Olivia isn't just sent into exile. Her father sells her into slavery, where she eventually becomes the sex slave of a depraved nobleman. She has the same amount of choice in her fate as being forced to be the role of a doting wife to a man she doesn't love, for the purposes of her father and husband's glory and power. She may have had a more posh and luxurious life as the wife of a nobleman, and he may have even been a decent husband. However, in both cases, she still loses the ability to make her own life. No matter what she does, she's viewed by every man in her life as a piece of property that can be traded and sold for their own benefit. This sort of backstory makes the love plot between Conan and Olivia one of the more realistic ones I think we've seen so far in these Robert E. Howard Conan stories. Towards the end of this one, Olivia watches Conan be knocked unconscious and kidnapped. She finds herself strangely distraught over the barbarian's fate. She realizes that she had come to feel some love for Conan, a fellow outcast. She thinks about how Conan, despite the horrifying initial impression he had made on her, the barbarian treated her much better than any man she had ever met before in her life. She remembers when she and Conan were sailing towards the island, and she was telling the Cimmerian of her backstory about how her cruel father had sold her into slavery. Upon hearing this, Conan is visibly offended and reviled by this idea. He remarks that Cimmerians do not sell their children. It's an insult to his culture to engage in such evil things. While Conan is willing to and capable of butchering men into an unrecognizable heap of gore, he doesn't engage in the evils of civilized men, the people that Olivia has spent most of her life around. She remembers how Conan is the only man in her life that has ever done anything for her without it being some scheme to gain something from her or to control her. Throughout the story and without fail, Conan protects Olivia without asking for anything in return. She comes to love that Conan doesn't try to manipulate her like civilized men do. He doesn't want to control her. He could have abandoned her and killed her master, but he chose to show her compassion and kindness. The man that Conan had killed in front of her, as scary as a display as it was a man who was her slave master. Just before Conan had approached out of the reeds, he had been telling Olivia of how he wanted to torture and rape her. In effect, Conan had broken her chains and attempted to place no further ones upon her. She was no longer under the thumb of a cruel father or a sadist master. In the circumstances Olivia finds herself in this world and the period of time it's set, I really do buy that she'd be attracted to Conan. Olivia is still a character who falls directly into the damsel in distress stereotype. She faints when danger approaches sometimes, etc. She's definitely not Red Sonja or anything. But Olivia does venture into the ruins where she knows wicked creatures cast in iron are about to spring to life and murder all of the pirates inside the ruins to rescue Conan. The Cimmerian definitely would have died if Olivia didn't go after him. She's brave and scrappy. At one point in the story, the gray man-ape charges at her in the darkness while she's alone in the forest, and she manages to escape. At the end of the story, when she asks to journey with Conan as his pirate queen, it doesn't feel unearned. In a world of extremely evil men, Conan is nobler than most. He's a thief and ravenous murderer in battle. But in these dark times, Conan is the only man who has treated Olivia as anything other than a sexual object or political bartering tool in her life. This, of course, was not an uncommon life or perspective for women born into noble families in humanity's distant past. As always, Howard brings a historical realism to these Conan stories that makes the world they take place in feel real and alive. In prior ages, like the medieval Europe that was one of Howard's influences on creating the Conan universe, marriage wasn't viewed in elite circles as an endeavor undertaken by two people who love each other. Intermarriage between men and women of noble families was the norm in medieval Europe. In most monarchical societies, men born into noble families were trained to be the heirs of their father's position and status. This is why medieval kings were often very intent on producing a male heir to inherit their legacy. King Henry VIII of England is perhaps the classic example of such a man, who ruled England from 1509 to 1547. Henry was born into the newly minted royal Tudor bloodline, and began his serious involvement in English politics at the age of 10, when his brother Arthur died unexpectedly. Henry's father, just the first monarch in this Tudor bloodline, immediately thrust the 10-year-old into his international political machinations. Prior to Arthur Tudor's death, his and Henry's father had arranged a marriage for him to Princess Catherine of Aragon, the daughter of King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain. The Tudor king had come to power through dubious means, to say the least. His bloodline claim to the throne was tenuous at best, and he had only ascended to being king after winning the position in a bloody civil war. These circumstances led to the Tudor dynasty not being widely accepted as legitimate among European elites, and the king needed to bring legitimacy to his dynasty in order to solidify his grip on power. Intermarriage between European royal families was a widely practiced means of establishing legitimacy, as the union would produce children with a more credible claim to rule by blood and fostered alliances between kingdoms via family ties. This is exactly why the Tudor king arranged for a marriage between his son Arthur and the Spanish princess Catherine. The union would show the rest of Europe that his dynasty would continue as a line of royal blood and create friendly relations between England and Spain. Catherine and Arthur's marriage was arranged when Catherine was just 3 and Arthur was 2. The pair was formally betrothed in a ceremony when they reached around the age of 15. To complete the transaction between the two families, a dowry of 200,000 gold ducats was paid to the Tudor family for offering their son as a husband to the Spanish royal's daughter. Shortly after the two teenagers had been formally married, Arthur died, and the decision was made that Catherine would be next married to Henry, Arthur's brother, instead, to accomplish the same goal of creating an alliance between England and Spain, and to further the legitimacy of the Tudor dynasty. Henry was 5 years younger than Catherine, and the two became king and queen of England when Henry was only 17. Henry and Catherine attempted many times to produce a male heir that would ensure the continuance of the Tudor dynasty's rule over England. However, all 3 of the sons that Catherine gave birth to during their marriage were either stillborn or died suddenly. Henry eventually had his marriage to Catherine annulled. She was stripped of her title as queen and banished from his court. Henry then married one of Catherine's ladies-in-waiting, who were a group of noblewoman servants tasked with attending to the queens and princesses of the court. This name was Anne Boleyn, and she too failed to produce a male heir for her husband. After she failed to live up to perhaps the most important queenly duty, Henry had Anne's brother and 4 other men arrested for having sexual relations with the queen. Anne, her brother, and the other men were convicted of adultery and sentenced to death. Anne was decapitated in a formal execution ceremony shortly thereafter. Henry's 3rd wife, Jane Seymour, one of Anne's ladies-in-waiting he had been sleeping with during his marriage, ended up being the woman who finally gave him the male heir he desired. This male heir was Edward Tudor, who would eventually ascend to the throne of England after his father's death at the age of 9, and died at the age of 15 due to illness. However, Jane died giving birth to this son, and Henry once again sought to remarry. He was briefly married to a woman named Anne of Cleves, before seeking an annulment when he fell in love with yet another one of the Queen's ladies-in-waiting, a 17-year-old named Catherine Howard. Howard and Henry were married, until it was discovered that Howard was carrying on an affair with one of Henry's friends, and in response, Henry also had her beheaded. After this, Henry married his 6th and final wife, a wealthy widow named Catherine Parr. A political system that results in the beheading of wives and 9-year-old kings seems insane to the modern eye, but this is the way that England and much of the rest of Europe functioned politically for hundreds of years. Marriage was a transaction between families to consolidate wealth or power in privileged groups. It was not unknown for the right to marry a princess to be traded between elites before the princess was even fully grown. In 1500s Europe and many other places around the world, women had a very rigid role in society that was difficult to transcend should they wish to do other things with their lives. Olivia is a woman who lives in a world very much like Europe during its darker age. She is expected to serve her role dutifully as a pawn of her husband and father. Olivia must be a tool in securing her father's position as king and bearing male children to continue her husband's royal legacy. This role gives little room for choice or love, but that wasn't really why people got married most of the time, at least amongst the class Olivia belongs to as a noblewoman. The most important decisions about her life were made by men who wished to use her, likely before she had the capacity to make an informed decision about something as important as who will be her mate, where she will live, and how she will spend the rest of her days on this planet. One can understand and admire why Olivia resisted this restrictive social arrangement. It's likely that Olivia's culture had embraced this sort of marriage arrangement for hundreds, if not thousands of years. Openly opposing traditions that have proven beneficial to the politically connected and powerful for generations is a very dangerous game to play for a noblewoman. Even for a woman born into extravagant privilege, as Olivia was for her time, life did not afford her the luxury of marrying a man for love. Marriage for Hyborian age nobility resembles something more like a business transaction than a partnership undertaken by people who love each other. When Olivia explains these grim realities that have defined her life to Conan, the barbarian is reviled by them. He tells her that the selling of one's children for profit or power is a heinous act to people of his Cimmerian culture. Their conversation begs the question, exactly how savage are Conan and his people? And how civilized are these more decadent societies with an entrenched aristocracy? Yes, Conan is a wild man and a warrior. We see Olivia describe Conan as a monstrous creature of bloodthirsty vengeance when he pounces on her slave master. However, after his vengeful instincts are satiated, the barbarian is able to control his more unpleasant, bestial qualities. Civilized men of power and influence like her father and slave master, noblemen thought to be the pinnacle of civilized life, seem much crueler to her than a man like Conan. Conan kills and thieves for a living, but his cruelty is less organized, and it seems directed at the people she believes deserve some level of cruelty being wrought upon them. Is a king who would doom his own daughter to a life of slavery, sexual humiliation, physical and mental abuse, etc., any less morally reprehensible than a cutthroat who sails the seas stealing from men like Olivia's father? The answer to that question is left to us as the readers to decide, but the answer is certainly clear to Olivia. Living life as the pirate queen of a bloodthirsty cutthroat and thief is preferable to her because she at least had the freedom to choose Conan as the one she loved. At the end of the story, she's finally under the thumb of an evil and domineering man no longer. These themes about womanhood during humanity's darker days are what elevate Iron Shadows in the Moon above some of Howard's less enjoyable stories for me personally, like The Pool of the Black One. As has been my experience thus far, I say that I like some Conan stories less than others, but I certainly don't completely dislike any of the ones I've read. I simply mean there's a variance in quality among Howard's Conan work. I personally prefer stories that are driven by strong characterization and thematic ideas rather than plot-driven ones generally, but it's always a matter of balance. Plotting is very important in giving the ideas and characters in the story weight, of course, and I think the plot of Iron Shadows in the Moon is one of Howard's weakest efforts thus far. It really does read like a hodgepodge of unrelated ideas that aren't given the focus needed to make the events of the story that compelling at all. Howard has expanded upon just about every plot idea here in other middle period Conan stories in a more interesting way in my view, and even took ideas from some of the ones he wrote earlier, like The Frost Giant's Daughter. However, the interesting themes about what it was like for Olivia to live as a noblewoman during an age where marriage was a matter of business and politics rather than a matter of individual choice saved this one from being my least favorite Conan story thus far in my review and retrospective series on these Howard Conan stories. Conan is, of course, a very testosterone-driven series of stories, due just to who Conan is as a character and individual. I'm sure there are women who are Howard fans out there, but I suspect that Conan specifically is a series that appeals to a mainly male demographic. It was good to see a feminine perspective on these harsh, brutal, and savage times explored more thoroughly than any of the prior Howard stories that I've read so far in publication order. Olivia is among my favorite love interests for Conan, even despite Howard leaning still into the damsel in distress trope with her characterization at times. She's brave, scrappy, independent, and willing to shirk traditions imposed on her to find freedom. Conan also would have died if Olivia didn't rescue him. It's a clever twist on the damsel in distress trope to have the hero saved by the damsel of the story. I quite liked that. Overall, Iron Shadows in the Moon still ranks low in which Conan stories are my favorite, but its redeeming elements keep it from being my least favorite. I suppose that's at least good. For me personally, it sits just above The Pool of the Black One. And so, dear listeners, we come to the end of my review and retrospective on Iron Shadows in the Moon. I'd like to thank every single one of you for watching, but before I let you go, I'd like to say a few words regarding how you can experience this story yourself and support the show if you'd like. I always include a link to the free audiobook of the story I'm reviewing in the description below, so you'll be able to find that there if you'd like to listen to an audio version of this story. It would also mean quite a bit to me if you subscribe to the channel, liked the video, and posted your thoughts on this story, my video, or anything else Conan related in the comments below. All of these sorts of engagements with the video here on the channel help Conan Chronicles get recommended to more people as they surf YouTube looking for things to watch. So if you enjoy the show or enjoyed just this episode, please do those things. It really helps a lot. I've also set up a Patreon for Conan Chronicles where you can support the show monetarily in any amount you'd like, which really helps. I already have one episode of the Grog House podcast, which is going to be our exclusive Patreon unscripted discussion podcast show with my friend Josh as a co-host. He's going to be the regular co-host, but we'll also be having guests. But I'm still waiting for the first episode that I'm going to be posting on the channel to be recorded. That one's going to be a review of Jason Aaron's run on Conan when it came back to Marvel Comics with, of course, Josh and my good friend Captain Logan of Geekvolution. That first episode is going to go up in its entirety on the channel for free, just so you guys can get a taste of what the podcast is going to be like. But the rest of the episodes after that will be posted exclusively on Patreon in full, and then I'll clip one or two things out from each episode for people who aren't interested in subscribing to the Patreon, so they can still at least enjoy some of the content. Conan Chronicles is also on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, so if you never want to miss an episode of the show, get updates on what's being done with it, and see some awesome pieces of Conan artwork that I find as I go and search for all the images I use for these episodes, check out all of our social media pages. I will also provide links to those in the description as well. Now that all of my messages and PSAs have concluded, I'd like to invite you, dear listener, to join me for the next episode. In the next show, we're going to be taking a look at the 10th story in Conan's publication history, Queen of the Black Coast. But until next time we meet, dear listener, I bid you farewell.
In spite of the terror of his wild appearance, Olivia looked to see him fall at the first crossing of the blades. Madman or savage, what could he do naked against the mailed chief of Akif? There was an instant when the blades flamed and licked, seeming barely to touch each other and leap apart. Then the broadsword flashed past the saber and descended terrifically on Shah Amaras's shoulder. Olivia cried out at the fury of that stroke. Above the crunch of the rending mail, she distinctly heard the snap of the shoulder bone. The Harkanian reeled back, suddenly ashen, blood spurting over the links of his halberd. His saber slipped from his nerveless fingers. "Quarter!" he gasped. "Quarter?" There was a quiver of frenzy in the stranger's voice. "Quarter, such as you gave us, you swine!" Olivia closed her eyes. This was no longer battle, but butchery, frantic, bloody, impelled by an hysteria of fury and hate, in which culminated the sufferings of battle, massacre, torture, and fear-ridden, thirst-maddened, hunger-haunted flight. She opened her eyes to see the stranger turning away from a gory travesty that only vaguely resembled a human being. He wheeled and stared at her. There was a difference in his bearing. His bloodshot eyes were sane. It was as if the blood he had just shed had quenched the fire of his frenzy.